There are faces that define an entire era. Julie Christie was such a face. In the 1960 seconds, she became the embodiment of British cinema. Rebellious, fragile, with a beauty that never felt calculated but seemed carved out of light and melancholy itself. Anyone who saw her in Darling, the 1965 masterpiece that won her the Academy Award, could never forget the way she revealed the restlessness of a whole generation with just one glance. But behind the screen icon lived a woman who understood far too early that fame was not only a gift, but also a prison. If you were to imagine the opening moments of a documentary about her life, it would feel like an overture. Christie, walking through the wide fields of Cornwall, her hair tousled by the wind, her eyes fixed on a horizon no one else could see. Her beauty feels untouchable, almost otherworldly, and yet there is a sadness wrapped around her like a cloak. Julie Christie was never just an actress. She was a symbol of freedom, of breaking old molds, of a woman trying to claim herself in a world eager to reduce women to roles written by others. Now, at 85 years of age, at a stage when many legends have turned into silent monuments, her story is no simple chronicle of glory. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of human existence. Because behind the myth lies a truth more tragic than heartbreaking. She experienced triumphs others could only dream of, but she paid with loneliness, with the gnawing sense of never truly belonging, and with an illness that slowly swept her memories away like sandcastles erased by the tide. Film history remembers her as the muse of David Lean, who cast her in Dr. Zhivago. Millions wept with her as Lara lost her great love in a Russian snowstorm. Yet few knew that Christie herself felt hollow during the shooting. The pressure, the adoration, the expectations, they consumed her. She was in her early 30s, celebrated worldwide, and yet in interviews she already spoke of longing for a simple life, far away from cameras and headlines. This tension between public adoration and private escape ran through her biography like a scar. It is the paradox of a star who never wanted to be a star. The press hunted her. Photographers camped outside her home. Producers drowned her in offers. And she said, no. Why? Because she knew that each project dragged her further into a life that no longer belonged to her. Colleagues called her difficult, unpredictable, but in truth, she was just a woman, desperately trying to save her soul. Looking back now, one could say Julie Christie embodied what later generations would call burnout or alienation. She was a pioneer, not only in art, but also in recognizing that no amount of success could replace inner balance. She withdrew, lived for years in rural seclusion, devoted herself to environmental and animal rights, and avoided Hollywood as if it were a disease. But the tragedy deepened with age. For an actress whose face had become a symbol, Timé's markings meant more than wrinkles. The world seemed to demand she remain forever young. Christie herself despised cosmetic surgery, declaring she wanted to age honestly, with dignity rather than a mask. It was a brave choice, but the price was harsh. Fewer roles, a fading public, and her transformation from the queen of cinema into a figure standing at its margins. And then came the cruelest twist: Alzheimer's, the slow theft of memory. For a woman whose greatest strength was recalling words, emotions, and characters, it was a death sentence delivered in fragments. Friends say that in lucid moments, she even joked about the bitter irony. "I spent my whole life trying to hide," she once murmured, "and now my life hides from me." The words cut like knives because they reveal the tragedy in all its mercilessness. Today, in the silence of her home, far away from flashing lights, Julie Christie exists between two worlds: the world of fame she never wanted, and the world of forgetting she never chose. Her story is not a fairy tale, not a happy ending. It is a warning that fame breaks what it promises to heal. It echoes for everyone who still believes success is everything. Imagine the camera cutting between past and present, her luminous eyes in old interviews, alive with clarity and hunger. Then, those same eyes today, dulled, unfocused, sometimes lost. The juxtaposition explains why this must be called a tragedy. It is not only the fading of an actress, it is the vanishing of an entire era along with her. Julie Christie was the voice of a generation that fought against convention. She was the flame that burned bright and vanished too soon. At 85, her story tells us not only of glory, but of the scars glory leaves behind. And perhaps within this tragedy lies a faint hope, that we might finally understand no red carpet can ever fill the emptiness of a human heart. Before she became the emblem of a cinematic revolution, before her face glowed across the silver screen, and her name carried the weight of an Oscar, Julie Christie was simply a child torn between two worlds. Her beginnings were not in the cobbled streets of London, nor in the artistic cafes of Paris, but in the lush and complicated land of colonial India. And those first years, filled with both wonder and dislocation, would plant in her the seeds of both brilliance and fragility. Julie Frances Christie was born on the 14th of April, 1940, in Chabua, Assam. Her father, Frank Street, John Christie, worked as a tea plantation manager, her mother, Rosemary, a painter with a restless spirit and an eye for beauty. India at that time was an empire on the brink of collapse, a land of intoxicating scents, of sweat and monsoon rains, of poverty and privilege. For the child Julie, it was both paradise and puzzle. Barefoot adventures in sprawling gardens, the hum of cicadas at night, and the sense, perhaps even then, that this world was never entirely hers. But the colonial story was unraveling. Britain's hold on India was weakening, and with it came the tremors of change. The Christies decided to return to England, and the little girl who had known freedom under a hot Indian sun found herself suddenly exiled into the damp winds of Cornwall. The contrast was brutal. Cornwall's rugged cliffs and stormy seas replaced the lush greenness of Assam. The salty air, the grey skies, the isolation, all of it pressed against her young soul. She became an outsider once more, a child caught between lands, never entirely belonging to either. At convent school, Julie was marked quickly as different. She was intelligent, sharp, but also restless, resistant. Teachers called her difficult, rebellious, a girl unwilling to bow to authority. While others recited lessons in obedience, Julie dared to question, to resist, to imagine another way of living. The rigid piety of the nuns clashed with her instinct for freedom. She would later confess that she never trusted institutions, never believed in rules that strangled the individual. That skepticism rooted in those schoolroom battles would shape her entire life, from her refusal of Hollywood conventions to her rejection of cosmetic illusions. But rebellion did not come only from resistance, it was also born from hunger. She devoured books, escaping into worlds beyond the confines of the convent walls. Her heroes were not film stars or royal figures, but women in novels who dared to fight against fate. In those stories, she found echoes of her own desire to carve out an identity that no institution, no man, no industry could dictate. Her mother's influence was quiet yet profound. Rosemary, with her painter's soul, saw in Julie a fire that she herself had been forced to bury. She encouraged her daughter's creativity, even as she tried, in the way mothers often do, to guide her toward safety, toward conformity. Julie sensed the contradiction, sensed the weight of unrealized dreams pressing against her mother's heart, and perhaps it was this unspoken inheritance, the ache of what her mother could not become, that pushed her to insist on becoming something more, whatever the cost. Her father, by contrast, was distant, a man of discipline and work. His love was not absent, but measured, sometimes cold. To win his approval was difficult, and for a child like Julie, that difficulty became both wound and armor. She learned to fight for attention, to wrestle for validation. Later, on screen, when her eyes burned with both defiance and fragility, it was this inner conflict that audiences felt. She was not simply acting. She was reliving a childhood rhythm of yearning and denial. Cornwall, with its wild seas and lonely hills, became both cradle and cage. Her classmates saw her as the girl from elsewhere, with strange stories of tea plantations and heat. That sense of never belonging hardened her, and it also freed her. If she was destined to be an outsider, then she would embrace it. If she was never going to fit neatly into society's boxes, then she would live outside of them altogether. As adolescence came, she was sent to Wycombe Court School in East Sussex. There, her reputation followed. Brilliant, fiery, unpredictable, teachers remembered her as the student who interrupted, who questioned, who refused to sit quietly. She did not want the answers the world gave. She wanted the questions that no one dared to ask. That search for truth, for authenticity, became the marrow of her later art. After finishing school, Christie flirted with conventional paths. She tried studying art in Paris, hoping perhaps that painting could satisfy the creative hunger she inherited from her mother. But the classrooms there felt like prisons too, the expectations suffocating. She left, drifting into odd jobs, childminder, shop clerk, secretary roles that never fit, clothes cut for someone else's body. The restlessness grew louder, the voice inside insisting, "You are meant for something different." It was the stage that finally offered her escape. Encouraged by friends, she applied to the Central School of Speech and Drama in London. For the first time, the rebellion in her blood found a place where it was not punished, but transformed. Acting gave her what life had denied her: freedom to inhabit other selves, freedom to channel her defiance into art. She could weep without shame, rage without consequence, dream without restraint. And yet, even here, nothing came easy. At drama school, some saw only her beauty, doubting her depth. She fought to prove she was not just a pretty face, but a soul burning with complexity. The rejection she had known since childhood became fuel. Each audition, each criticism, sharpened her resolve. She would not be dismissed. She would not be silenced. When you look back on her childhood, the architecture of her later life begins to make sense. Julie Christie was never a woman chasing fame. She was a girl taught too early that belonging is fragile, that institutions suffocate, that beauty is both blessing and trap. She was a young woman who had already learned to distrust the promises of authority, and who found in storytelling the only place where she could breathe. It was in those early collisions, India and England, mother and father, convent and rebellion, that Julie Christie was forged, not as a star, not as an icon, but as a woman destined to live forever in the tension between escape and belonging, forever in search of a freedom she would never completely hold. London, in the early 1960s, was alive with possibility. The old hierarchies of post-war Britain were cracking, and a new generation was demanding space on the streets, in music, in fashion, and on the screen. Julie Christie, restless and uncontainable, stepped into this moment like a spark falling on dry wood. What had been raw defiance in the convent classroom, what had been untamed energy in Cornwall, suddenly found its stage. Her first appearances were modest. Small roles in television dramas, fleeting characters that barely hinted at her potential. But there was something different about her presence, something that unsettled even in silence. Directors noticed the way the camera seemed to cling to her, as though her face carried not just beauty, but an inner narrative that pulled the viewer closer. She wasn't just reciting lines, she was transmitting a storm. In 1963, she landed a role in the film Billy Liar, directed by John Schlesinger. The part of Liz, a free-spirited young woman who offers the protagonist a chance to escape his dull provincial life, was not meant to be monumental. But when Christie stepped onto the screen, the film shifted its gravity. Liz was everything the New Britain longed to be: vivid, rebellious, alive with possibility. Christie didn't just play Liz, she was Liz, carrying in her every gesture the hunger of a generation desperate to break free from post-war grayness. Critics wrote about her as if she had come out of nowhere. Audiences remembered her even when the credits rolled. For Schlesinger, it was clear he had found a muse. And for Christie, it was the first time she felt that her rebellion had found purpose. She wasn't simply resisting, she was creating. The success of Billy Liar opened doors, but it was her next collaboration with Schlesinger that catapulted her into legend. Darling 1965 was more than a film, it was a manifesto. In it, Christie played Diana Scott, a young woman who rises from relative obscurity to the pinnacle of London's glittering social scene, only to discover that fame devours more than it gives. It was a role so eerily aligned with Christie's own fears and contradictions that it felt less like performance and more like confession. Her Diana was dazzling, infuriating, magnetic, and tragic. She embodied the contradictions of the 1960 seconds: liberation, entwined with emptiness, success drenched in loneliness. The film won Christie the Academy Award for Best Actress, and suddenly, the girl who had once been an outsider in Cornwall was the face of swinging London, a global star. Yet even as she stood on that Hollywood stage, accepting the golden statue, Christie felt a dissonance. The applause was deafening, but inside, she heard only the echo of her own doubts. Fame was dangerous. She had always known it. The more the world adored her, the more she feared disappearing into the mask of a character she had not written. Still, the roles kept coming, each one amplifying her legend. In 1965, she starred opposite Warren Beatty in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, directed by Robert Altman. Here, Christie brought haunting depth to Constance Miller, a woman whose sharpness and fragility carried equal weight. Critics marveled at the raw humanity she poured into the role. Her nomination for another Oscar proved that Darling was no accident. But it was David Lean's Dr. Zhivago that carved her into cinematic eternity. Cast as Lara, the luminous yet tragic heroine of Boris Pasternak's novel, Christie appeared before audiences not merely as an actress, but as an icon. The film's sweeping scale, its epic romance against the backdrop of the Russian Revolution, demanded a star who could embody both intimacy and grandeur. Christie delivered. Her eyes wide, searching, vulnerable, carried the grief of an entire century. When Yuri Zhivago and Lara were torn apart by history, millions of hearts shattered in unison. The global success of Dr. Zhivago turned Christie into something she had never wanted to be, a worldwide phenomenon. Suddenly, she was no longer just Britain's rebel actress, but Hollywood's prize. Magazines clamored for her image, studios flooded her with offers, gossip columns linked her with leading men. In the mythology of cinema, she had become untouchable. And yet, even at the peak of her rise, Christie resisted. While others would have leveraged fame into fortune, she withdrew. She declined roles that could have cemented her as a box-office queen. She famously turned down The Graduate, a film that went on to define American cinema in 1967. Producers thought she was mad. To Christie, it was simple. She would not be trapped in a system that demanded compliance. Behind the glamour lay exhaustion. Christie spoke in interviews about feeling alienated from the very industry that celebrated her. "I don't belong here," she once said quietly, even as photographers shouted her name on red carpets. She knew too well that the world adored Diana Scott, Lara, Constance Miller. But did it care about Julie? The dissonance widened, and with it grew her desire to retreat. But retreat is rarely possible at the height of stardom. The more she tried to slip away, the more the world reached for her. Her affair with Warren Beatty became the stuff of tabloids. Her politics, outspoken, often left-leaning, attracted both admiration and criticism. She spoke against the Vietnam War, supported environmental causes, and dismissed the idea that actors should remain silent. Unlike many of her peers, she was not afraid to jeopardize her career for conviction. The rise of Julie Christie, then, was never a smooth ascent. It was a climb lined with contradictions, a climb mingled with alienation, triumph shadowed by doubt. Every time she reached a new peak, she seemed to recoil, as if afraid of heights she had never asked for. But this tension, this refusal to surrender, is precisely what made her luminous. Because Julie Christie did not simply rise. She broke through, and in doing so, she broke the mold of what a star was supposed to be. She showed that beauty could carry defiance, that fame could coexist with protest, that the greatest performances are born not from compliance, but from rebellion. Her breakthrough was not only artistic, it was existential. For the girl from Assam and Cornwall, the outsider who had never truly belonged, the stage and screen became both battlefield and sanctuary. It gave her voice to the rebellion she had carried since childhood, but it also amplified the loneliness that had haunted her all along. And so, while the world celebrated the rise of Julie Christie, she herself looked at it differently. For her, the ascent was never about triumph. It was about survival in a world too eager to define her. And survival, as she knew even then, was always fragile. By the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds, Julie Christie stood at the summit of cinema. She was not just a star, she was a symbol, the kind of figure who transcended her roles and came to represent an era itself. London was swinging, Hollywood was shifting, and the world was searching for new icons. Julie Christie was there, her image shimmering like a beacon of beauty, independence, and mystery. She belonged to a rare category of actresses whose faces seemed to hold entire stories. Photographers worshipped her bone structure, critics exalted her naturalism, and audiences felt as though they knew her, even when she gave them nothing more than a glance. In an age when actresses were often packaged into predictable archetypes, the innocent, the seductress, the muse, Christie stood apart. She carried both seduction and innocence, intellect and fragility. She was never one thing, never fixed, always a storm just out of reach. Hollywood courted her relentlessly. She appeared alongside some of the most magnetic men of her generation. Warren Beatty, Robert Redford, Omar Sharif, Alan Bates. Each pairing amplified her mystique. With Beatty, she exuded electricity, their off-screen romance feeding the myth of glamour. With Redford, she radiated a softness that contrasted his all-American masculinity. With Sharif and Dr. Zhivago, she embodied romance so convincingly that audiences believed Lara and Yuri were eternal lovers, fated to meet even as history tore them apart. But Christie resisted becoming a product of the studio machine. Where other stars accepted the machinery of Hollywood, the contracts, the publicity tours, the endless demands, she recoiled. She turned down scripts that promised fortune, but offered no soul. Her choices bewildered producers, but built her legend. She was the star who could not be bought. This refusal became part of her allure. Julie Christie was glamorous, yes, but she was also unknowable. Journalists often complained about her interviews. She dodged personal questions, refused to play the role of starlet. Instead, she spoke about politics, about the environment, about feminism. At a time when women were still expected to smile prettily and remain apolitical, Christie used her platform to challenge. She criticized the Vietnam War, lent her voice to progressive movements, and questioned the very industry that had elevated her. And yet, the pinnacle of her fame was not measured in activism alone. It was in her performances, which deepened with each project. In Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller 1000, 971, she shattered expectations again. As Constance Miller, the opium-smoking madam of a frontier town, Christie was both tough and heartbreakingly vulnerable. Her performance was so textured, so unflinchingly human, that critics hailed it as one of the great achievements of American cinema. She earned another Academy Award nomination, proof that her artistry was no accident of youth, but the result of fearless dedication. The 1,970 seconds were filled with roles that cemented her as one of the finest actresses of her generation. In Don't Look Now, 1973, Nicholas Roeg's chilling masterpiece, she gave perhaps her most haunting performance. As Laura Baxter, a grieving mother navigating the shadows of loss in Venice, Christie displayed a depth of emotion that left audiences shaken. The film's notorious love scene with Donald Sutherland was not scandalous because of its eroticism. It was devastating because it felt real, an unguarded glimpse into intimacy, grief, and the desperation of holding on to life. By this time, Christie could have ruled Hollywood. She had the acclaim, the beauty, the versatility, but instead of chasing dominance, she seemed to step sideways, choosing projects that intrigued her rather than those that promised blockbusters. She starred in Shampoo, 1975, another collaboration with Warren Beatty, playing a woman torn between desire and disillusionment. The film captured the disintegration of American innocence in the post-1960 seconds haze, and Christie's performance gave it its aching center. Her fame during these years was immense, but fame for Christie was always double-edged. The more the world worshipped her, the more she withdrew. She would vanish from Hollywood for stretches of time, resurfacing in Britain, living quietly, almost anonymously. Paparazzi hunted her, but she slipped through their nets with an almost ghostly ease. Even as the pinnacle of her career stretched wide before her, Christie was already plotting her escape routes. Friends and colleagues often remarked that she seemed uneasy with adoration. She once admitted in an interview, "I find it embarrassing to be admired. It feels like they love a version of me that isn't me at all." That sentence captures the heart of Julie Christie's paradox. She was adored precisely because she refused to play along. She gave the audience authenticity in her performances, but she withheld herself in life. The gap between those two realities created her legend and her loneliness. At the very top of the cinematic world, Christie faced temptations that could have transformed her into a caricature of celebrity. Drugs, money, endless parties, many of her contemporaries drowned in them, but Christie sought something else. She lived in modest homes, often preferring the countryside to the city. She spent time with animals, involved herself in conservation. While others measured success in mansions and limousines, Christie measured it in freedom, the ability to say no, to vanish, to live outside the cage of expectations. But even at her most withdrawn, she remained magnetic. Directors continued to beg for her presence, and when she returned, she lit the screen as though she had never been gone. She had a rare ability to disappear for years, and yet re-emerge with performances that redefined her era. Few stars in history have wielded such power, not by constant visibility, but by scarcity, by the deliberate mystery of absence. The pinnacle of her fame was therefore not a single film, not a single award, but a paradox. Julie Christie, at once everywhere and nowhere, the most admired actress of her generation, and its most elusive. She proved that a woman could be powerful in Hollywood, not by submitting to its rules, but by breaking them. And in doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a star. Still, in this triumph lay the seeds of tragedy. Because the very qualities that made her luminous, the mystery, the refusal, the retreat, also isolated her. She was celebrated yet solitary, adored yet misunderstood. Even as her fame soared to the heavens, Christie herself looked down at the heights with unease, as though she knew that every summit contains its own cliff's edge. For the audience, Julie Christie at the pinnacle was a goddess of the screen. For Christie herself, it was a fragile balancing act on the edge of disappearance. And one day, she would let herself fall not into ruin, but into obscurity. A choice few could understand, but one she felt was the only way to remain true. Every rise casts a shadow, and even at the dazzling height of her fame, Julie Christie could not escape the darkness. Her life was never littered with the loud scandals that devoured some of her contemporaries. She was too private, too elusive for that. But her shadows were quieter, deeper, and perhaps more destructive. They were not headlines, they were fractures of the soul. One of the most enduring myths surrounding Julie Christie was her relationship with Warren Beatty. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of Hollywood glamour. The rebellious British actress and the charming American playboy, photographed at premieres, whispered about in gossip columns. But behind the flashes of cameras, their romance was turbulent. Beatty, notorious for his infidelities, carried a reputation that no amount of charisma could disguise. Christie loved him, but she also feared him, not the man he himself, but what he represented, the lure of Hollywood's excess, the seduction of a life she had never wanted. Their relationship stretched over years, on and off, love and betrayal, intimacy and distance. Friends said she was both devoted and exhausted, drawn to Beatty's brilliance, yet drained by his volatility. In her rare, candid moments, Christie admitted that she struggled with the power imbalance, the sense that her life risked being consumed by his orbit. Though she would later insist that she held her ground, the relationship left scars. It reinforced her distrust of Hollywood, of men who wielded fame like a weapon, of the industry that saw women as ornaments to be admired, but rarely as equals to be respected. Christie's resistance to Hollywood's machinery became more pronounced in the 1,970 seconds. She turned down roles that would have made her a household name in America. She refused to play the game of endless publicity, refused to allow studios to shape her image. To the public, it looked like arrogance. To Christie, it was survival. Yet, the cost was high. Each refusal distanced her further from mainstream cinema. Each rejection of the system isolated her more from the audience that once adored her. She was not ruined by scandal, but by choice. At the same TMA, Christie's political convictions alienated her from certain circles. She spoke openly against the Vietnam War, supported socialist causes, and lent her name to environmental campaigns. In an era when actors were expected to smile for the cameras and avoid controversy, Christie broke the unspoken rules. She risked her career to stand by her principles. While some admired her courage, others labeled her difficult, radical, even ungrateful. Producers whispered that she was unreliable, unwilling to compromise. Slowly, the offers began to dwindle, but it wasn't just politics or Beatty that haunted her, it was something more intimate. Christie carried within her a profound sense of restlessness, a dissatisfaction that no amount of success could soothe. She confessed in later interviews that she never felt at home in her own skin, never truly comfortable with fame, beauty, or the public gaze. Her retreat from Hollywood was not only rebellion, it was escape. Escape from a stage that demanded more than she could give. Escape from an identity she never chose. This restlessness grew heavier as the years passed. By the late 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, Christie had almost disappeared from the screen, while her contemporaries fought for relevance, reinventing themselves in blockbuster roles or television projects. Christie stepped into the shadows. She lived quietly in Wales, surrounded by animals, immersed in activism. For many, it seemed like a collapse. A star who had once commanded the world, now fading into obscurity. But the collapse was not merely professional. Christie struggled privately with depression, though she rarely named it. Friends described her as moody, withdrawn, sometimes unreachable. She often spoke of the emptiness behind success, the futility of chasing applause. In her solitude, she found peace, but also isolation. The woman who had once embodied the vitality of a generation was now battling the silence of her own mind. And then came the cruelest enemy of all, memory itself. In her later years, Christie began showing signs of cognitive decline. What started as forgetfulness grew into something darker, the slow encroachment of Alzheimer's. For a woman whose art depended on memory, on the recall of lines, the conjuring of emotions, this was a devastation beyond scandal. It was an erasure of self, a theft of the very thing that made her Julie Christie. The tragedy lay in the irony. She had spent her life fleeing the spotlight, desperate for anonymity, and now, as her memories unraveled, she was given the ultimate anonymity, her own life slipping beyond recognition. She once remarked, in a moment of clarity, "I always tried to disappear. Now I don't have to try." The words, heavy with both humor and grief, cut through like prophecy. Her decline was not public spectacle. Her family and friends protected her fiercely. But whispers circulated. Reports surfaced that she no longer remembered certain roles, certain people, certain moments that had once defined her. For fans who had adored her as Lara, as Diana Scott, as Constance Miller, the thought was unbearable. That the woman who had given the world such unforgettable performances might not remember them herself. Julie Christie's scandals, then, were never the ones Hollywood thrives on. They were not lurid affairs splashed across tabloids, nor drunken collapses in hotel rooms. Her scandals were quieter, interior, hidden in the spaces the world could not see. The scandal of refusing fame when the world begged her to embrace it. The scandal of walking away when others would have sold their souls to stay. The scandal of being a woman who demanded to live on her own terms, even if it meant fading into obscurity. And the collapse was not dramatic ruin. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply human. It was the collapse of a star who chose silence over spectacle, obscurity over compromise, authenticity over survival in the Hollywood machine. But it was also the collapse of memory, the erosion of the self, the final betrayal of a mind that once carried so much brilliance. In the end, the dark side of Julie Christie's story is not that she fell from grace, but that she refused grace altogether. She refused the false comfort of fame, the glittering trap of immortality, and chose instead a path that led her into shadows few could follow. The world remembers her as luminous, but she herself seemed to vanish, step by step, into a silence she had been courting all her life. The consequences of Julie Christie's choices, her resistance, and her decline were not measured in box office numbers or headlines. They were carved into the very fabric of her life, shaping her legacy not as a story of fame alone, but of the profound loneliness and cost that came with refusing the script that Hollywood had written for her. By the time, the 1,980 seconds gave way to the 1,990 seconds. Julie Christie was no longer a regular fixture in cinema. For most actresses, absence equals irrelevance. But for Christie, absence became its own myth. Directors still longed for her. Audiences still remembered her. But she appeared less and less, choosing parts sporadically, as if dipping her toes into a world she no longer fully trusted. Each return was met with reverence, an acknowledgement that when she did appear, she reminded the world of what acting could be. Raw, honest, unpretentious. Her withdrawal, however, came at a personal price. Fame is a double-edged sword. To reject it is to invite obscurity, and obscurity has its own cruelty. While her contemporaries courted the spotlight and secured their immortality through constant reinvention, Christie risked being forgotten. She had once been the embodiment of a cultural revolution, and now she lived in near anonymity, tucked away in the countryside, caring for animals, lending her voice to causes rather than characters. This was the first consequence, the erosion of her public presence. For audiences who had adored her as Lara in Dr. Zhivago or Diana Scott in Darling, her silence felt like abandonment. She had given them stories that touched their souls, only to retreat into a world where she no longer seemed to exist. Some critics claimed she wasted her potential, that she could have been the greatest actress of her generation had she embraced the system. But Christie never saw herself as wasted. To her, the real waste would have been surrender, living a life dictated by others. The second consequence was more intimate: isolation. Fame isolates by putting one on a pedestal, but Christie's withdrawal isolated her in a different way, by taking her off the stage altogether. Friends came and went. Relationships fractured. Even her long entanglement with Warren Beatty eventually dissolved, leaving behind a residue of heartbreak and resilience. Christie sought companionship elsewhere, but she never seemed to need the constant company of the industry, never sought the validation of parties or premieres. She lived quietly with a long-term partner, journalist Duncan Campbell, and their relationship, grounded in simplicity rather than spectacle, provided her with stability she had long craved. But stability did not erase solitude. In the absence of the roar of applause, silence grows loud. Then came the cruelest consequence of all, the slow decay of memory. Alzheimer's does not arrive like a storm, but creeps like a thief, stealing piece by piece, until even the familiar becomes foreign. For an actress whose craft depended on inhabiting lives, remembering words, channeling experiences, it was a devastating betrayal. As her illness progressed, Christie faced the loss not only of herself, but of the very art that had defined her. Friends and colleagues protected her fiercely, refusing to let the tabloids exploit her condition. But whispers persisted, that she no longer remembered the roles that made her immortal, that sometimes she failed to recognize the faces of those she once loved. There is a haunting tragedy in this. Julie Christie, the woman who had fled the spotlight for fear of being consumed by fame, was now consumed by forgetting. Her life became the ultimate paradox. She had spent decades running from recognition, only to have recognition itself stolen from her mind. For her admirers, the thought was unbearable. How could the woman who once carried the grief of nations in her eyes no longer carry her own history? The legacy of this pain stretches beyond Christie herself. Her story became a mirror for the illusions of fame. It showed how the very thing the world craves, immortality through cinema, can never protect against the most human of fates: decline, solitude, and loss. In her later years, Christie's absence from Hollywood became a presence of its own. Younger generations discovered her through old films, marveled at her brilliance, and asked why she had disappeared. The answer was never simple. She vanished because she refused to sell herself. She vanished because she chose authenticity over applause. And she vanished because life, in its cruelty, demanded it. For women in film, her story carried particular resonance. At a time when actresses were pressured to mutilate themselves for eternal youth, Christie refused. She aged naturally, defiantly, her face becoming a map of experience rather than a mask of denial. This defiance cost her roles, but it gave her dignity. In an industry obsessed with preserving youth, she preserved truth. That choice, painful as it was, became part of her legacy, a legacy that inspired countless women to demand more, to accept age not as exile, but as evolution. But dignity does not erase pain. Christie's retreat from the stage left a void in cinema. Critics often wondered what she might have achieved had she stayed, what characters she might have embodied had she continued her ascent. The speculation itself became part of her myth. Julie Christie, the star who might have been even greater had she not walked away. The tragedy, of course, is that speculation is endless, while Time is finite. The consequences of Julie Christie's life choices, then, are written in both admiration and sorrow. She is admired for her courage, for refusing the machinery of Hollywood, for standing firm in her principles. She is mourned for the roles she never played, the stories she never told, the light she allowed to flicker rather than blaze, and she is pitied for the cruel illness that stripped her of the very memories that once made her immortal. And yet, there is something strangely fitting in this paradox. Julie Christie's legacy is not one of neat resolution, but of contradiction. She was luminous yet elusive, celebrated yet solitary, immortal on screen yet fading in life. Her story forces us to ask what it means to succeed, what it means to survive fame, and what it means to live authentically even when authenticity leads to pain. Perhaps this is the final consequence of her life, that her tragedy is not hers alone, but ours as well. We, the audience, are left grieving not only the woman, but the reflection of our own illusions. We worshipped her beauty, her youth, her rebellion, but we failed to understand the cost. Now, as she slips further into silence, we are forced to face the truth, that every star, no matter how bright, must one day fade. Julie Christie's legacy, therefore, is a reminder that cinema can grant immortality, but life remains fragile, a reminder that beauty dazzles, but it cannot shield against Time, a reminder that rebellion may save one's soul, but it cannot spare one's heart. And in this painful legacy lies her true greatness, not in her perfection, but in her humanity. Legends are not made only by the lives they live, but by the questions they leave behind. Julie Christie, now 85, has become one of those rare figures whose legacy is defined as much by her silences as by her words, as much by her absences as by her appearances. Her heritage is not just cinematic, it is existential. She has left us with a mirror held up to fame, love, beauty, and mortality. And what we see reflected is not an icon untouchable, but a woman who dared to live on her own terms, even when those terms cut deep. The films remain. Darling, Dr. Zhivago, McCabe, and Mrs. Miller, Don't Look. Now they stand as monuments to her artistry, etched forever in celluloid. Generations who never knew swinging London, who never felt the political heat of the 1,960 seconds, can still look into her eyes on screen and feel the storm of an era. Few actors possess that power, the ability to carry Time itself in their gaze. When Christie's Diana Scott walks through a London party, restless and unsatisfied, we see not just a character, but an entire generation's hunger. When Lara, in Dr. Zhivago, loses her love to history, we grieve not only for her but for the cruelty of fate. Christie's gift was not performance alone, it was transformation. She did not act emotions, she transmitted them. But beyond the films, there is another heritage, the way she lived. In refusing the machinery of Hollywood, she revealed a truth many dared not say aloud, that fame is a gilded cage, that beauty is a trap, that applause can be as suffocating as it is intoxicating. She showed that a woman could walk away from the spotlight and still carry power. For actresses who followed those who refused to be typecast, those who resisted plastic surgery, those who chose activism over popularity, Julie Christie was a quiet pioneer. She paid a price, yes, but she cleared a path. Her life is also a cautionary tale. Her withdrawal reminds us how easy it is for even the brightest flame to flicker when it refuses to be fed by the machinery of celebrity. Her illness reminds us that memory itself is fragile, that even the immortal faces of cinema are mortal after all. Julie Christie once represented the freedom of the 60s, the rebellion against conformity. Now she represents something far more universal, the vulnerability of being human. And this duality, icon and exile, beauty and decline, creates the open question at the heart of her story. Was Julie Christie's retreat a victory or a loss? Did she preserve her authenticity, or did she squander her talent? Did she live courageously, or did she run from the very gift that could have changed cinema forever? The answers depend on who is asking. For some, her life is a triumph. She refused to be consumed by the industry, refused to let her face be sculpted into a lie, refused to let her art be reduced to commerce. She lived honestly, even if it meant stepping away. That honesty is rare, and in its rarity lies her greatness. For others, her life is a tragedy. She could have been greater, they say. She could have been the Meryl Streep of her generation, the queen of every decade, had she only embraced the stage she was given. Instead, she turned away. And with her turning, she denied the world countless stories that only she could have told. The tragedy is not just in what she lost, but in what we lost with her. And then there is the cruelest layer of all, the Alzheimer's that has begun to erase her from herself. In her absence from memory, we find the sharpest question of all. What remains when the mind dissolves? If Julie Christie forgets Lara, Diana Scott, Constance Miller, do they still exist? The answer is in the films, yes, but more profoundly, it is in us. For every viewer who remembers, for every heart that still aches when Lara turns her face toward Yuri Zhivago in that final scene, Julie Christie remains. Memory is fragile, but cinema is collective memory, and it holds her even when she cannot hold herself. Her heritage, then, is not simply the films she made, but the truths she forced us to confront. She revealed that beauty cannot shield us from loneliness, that success cannot save us from emptiness, that even icons will one day fade. And yet, in fading, she illuminated something even brighter: the dignity of imperfection, the courage of refusal, the poetry of silence. Perhaps the final image of Julie Christie is not Lara on a snowy street, not Diana Scott at a London party, but the woman herself, older, weathered, walking across the wild fields of Cornwall, the wind in her hair, her face turned toward the horizon, still untamed, still restless, still refusing to be defined. That image is both heartbreaking and liberating. It tells us that legends are not meant to be perfect. They are meant to show us the fractures, so that in their brokenness we might find our own reflection. At 85, Julie Christie's tragedy is beyond heartbreaking, because it is not only hers. It belongs to all of us who believed that art could protect us from time, that beauty could outlast pain, that love could conquer loss. Her story tells us that none of these illusions hold. But it also tells us something else, that even when memory fades, even when silence swallows, the truth of a life lived authentically endures. And so, her legacy remains suspended in an open question. Was she a rebel who preserved her soul, or a fugitive who abandoned her art? Was she a cautionary tale, or an inspiration? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps that is the point. Julie Christie, the girl from Assam and Cornwall, the star of swinging London, the muse of David Lean, the lover of Warren Beatty, the recluse, the activist, the fading legend, she was never one thing. She was always contradiction. She was always storm. And as the curtain falls on her story, as the world watches her slip further into silence, we are left with the question she never answered. What does it mean to live a life true to yourself, even when that truth breaks the hearts of everyone else?